Well, hey folks, I hope you enjoy this little parody on silent films and the Lori Daybell saga. Now, before we talk about legal standards, before we break down the appellate rules, we need to stop and talk about identity. Because this appeal wasn't written like a legal document. It was written like testimony. Lori Daybell, convicted of murder, isn't arguing facts. She's arguing meaning. So tonight, we're stepping into a little different frame. It's a little more black and white world. Maybe some heavy shadows, some sacred certainty. And when Lori speaks, she isn't pleading, she's proclaiming. Now, the state calls this a criminal appeal. Lori would call it scripture in captivity. In her telling, prison isn't punishment, it's proof.
I am an artificial intelligence voice reading what Profiling Evil believes Lori Daybell must be thinking as she reviews her appeal. From the place they insist is my rightful home, they say this cell is where I belong. Steel bars, concrete floors, lights that never turn off. Very dramatic, very official. They like the permanence of it. It helps them feel finished. But profits have always been stored away by people who confuse obedience to God with disobedience to authority. Joseph was imprisoned. Daniel was caged. Christ was tried. All of them inconvenient. All of them misunderstood. All of them surrounded by people absolutely certain they were right. That's the part history always repeats. They tell themselves this is justice. That paperwork and verdicts can cancel revelation. They think silence equals defeat. They think distance equals doubt. They've always thought that. They looked at my life and saw chaos. Too many marriages. Too much certainty. Too much faith expressed without their permission. They say I destroyed order. But what unsettled them was a structure they weren't invited into. A hierarchy they didn't sit atop. A truth that didn't ask for approval. They didn't see madness. They saw confidence without apology. And that frightened them. So they labeled it, diagnosed it, scheduled hearings around it. They debated my competence. As if revelation requires consensus. They held proceedings while I waited. They spoke while I was silent. They decided while I was unavailable to disagree. How efficient of them. They say I'm confined. But confinement has never been the end of a calling. It's usually where clarity sharpens. They think they closed a chapter. They think the jury finished the story. But history has never been written by the people who felt most comfortable at the time. They locked the door and congratulated themselves on resolution. And still, they cannot stop the truth from continuing to exist without their consent.
Did you notice what's already missing? When you listen to these kinds of narratives, you expect to hear something about children. You expect to hear a husband being mentioned. You expect at some point for the people who actually died to enter the story, but they never do. There's no acknowledgement of the children who were supposed to be protected. There's no mention of a husband whose life ended violently. There are no victims at all, really, at least not in the way that most of us would understand. Instead, the victim is Lori Daybell. The focus shifts away from the victims entirely. It moves away from the harm, away from the responsibility, away from the human cost. And what takes their place is destiny, sort of a sense of calling, a belief that events didn't happen because of choices, but they happened because they were meant to happen. In this version of the story, suffering isn't caused, it's justified. Death isn't explained, it's reframed. And that's an important thing to notice early on, because once the narrative centers on destiny instead of people, everything that follows starts to make a certain kind of sense, at least to the person who's telling this story. That's how this story gets told without ever naming the people who ultimately paid the price. Now, the first legal claim is about her lawyer. On paper, it looks procedural, a dispute over counsel of choice, a disagreement over ethic rules and conflicts of interest, the kind of issues that usually live quietly in appellate briefs and courtroom transcripts. But listen closely to how Lori reframes it, because in her version, this isn't about rules or safeguards. It's not about professional responsibility or protecting the integrity of the process. Those details barely matter to her story at all. Instead, it becomes something much bigger, something darker, something almost cosmic. Now, what should be a legal question turns into spiritual warfare, a battle between beliefs and persecution, between those who understand and those who supposedly never could. The lawyer isn't just a lawyer anymore. He's actually a defender of truth, a witness to her calling. Someone taken away, not because of conflict, but because the system couldn't tolerate what he represented. And once you see that shift, once procedure becomes prophecy, you begin to understand why the appeal reads the way that it does. Because in this story, the courtroom isn't a courtroom, it's a battlefield.
They called it a conflict of interest. That's the phrase they like to use when they want something to sound technical, reasonable, neutral. But what they really meant, what they never say out loud, is that one man dared to stand with the anointed. He listened to me. He believed me. He understood that truth doesn't splinter just because more than one person speaks it. They act like truth is fragile, like it shatters the moment two voices agree, as if alignment itself is suspicious. They say he couldn't represent both of us, as though truth can only belong to one mouth at a time, as though agreement automatically means corruption. That's not fear of confusion. Confusion would have worked in their favor. What they feared was unity. They feared two people saying the same thing, without hesitation, without contradiction, without asking permission, because unity removes doubt, and doubt is where they live. And they know the scripture as well as I do, even if they pretend they don't. When two witnesses agree, their testimony stands. That's not my rule. That's not Mark's rule. That's theirs. And that's why he had to go.
This is textbook narrative changing, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. What started out as an ethic issue, somehow every court has to take seriously, gets flipped on its head. Professional rules about conflicts of interest suddenly become persecution. Safeguards that are designed to protect the fairness of the trial are actually recast as suppression, as if the system is trying to crush something sacred. Well, in reality, the court removed a conflicted attorney because that's what the judges are supposed to do. The goal wasn't punishment. It's not retaliation. The goal was making sure that one defendant wasn't harmed by divided loyalties, especially in a conspiracy case where interests can change overnight and one person's defense can come at another person's expense. And that's not how Lori tells it. Because in her version, the lawyer isn't disqualified because of conflict. He's taken away because he understood, because he believed, because he stood too close to the truth. Now, the judge isn't managing a case anymore. He's silencing a disciple, according to Lori. And that shift matters, because once you accept that kind of framing, nothing the court does can ever be neutralized again. Every ruling will become hostile. Every safeguard becomes suspicious. Every consequence becomes proof of persecution. That's how accountability gets turned into martyrdom, one reframed decision at a time. Well, next, Lori claims that the hearings happened without her while she was deemed incompetent. And on the surface, it sounds pretty alarming. Most people hear that and they immediately think, how on earth could a court move forward when someone isn't considered competent to participate? But to the law, this is largely procedural because when a defendant is found incompetent, their case is stayed, it's paused, put on a shelf, except for a very few things that the law will allow. Now, that doesn't mean that the entire judicial system freezes in place, especially when there's a co-defendant and a separate case, a defendant with his own case moving forward on a parallel track. And that distinction really matters again in this case because what Lori's framing as something happening to her was actually happening in Chad Daybell's separate case. The court wasn't secretly moving her prosecution forward behind her back. It was managing two related cases, two cases that were distinctly different legally, cases under very specific rules. But listen how Lori reframes this, because in her narrative, this wasn't something that was procedural. It was exile. It was her being pushed out, being talked over, her thoughts being erased while decisions were made by people that she believed never had the right to decide anything at all. And once again, the legal reality and the personal narrative split, one grounded in process, the other grounded in grievance.
They said my mind was unfit, that my clarity was delusion, that my certainty was sickness. Interesting choice of words, coming from people who change their minds. Every time a motion is filed, they say I was broken, unstable, unable to participate in my own defense. And so they locked me away, not because I was confused, not because I was lost, but because I would not bend. They wrapped it in medical language, clinical phrases, diagnoses that sound so clean. When written on paper, competent, incompetent, restored. As if revelation works on a schedule. They spoke about my life, about my intentions, about my future. In rooms where my voice was not invited, they decided what mattered, while I was declared irrelevant. They debated my thoughts, while pretending not to fear them. And that's the part they never explain. Because prophets are always declared mad, before they are inconvenient, and inconvenient before they are silenced. Joseph was called a dreamer, Daniel a troublemaker, Christ a blasphemer. History is very consistent that way. They say I was unfit, but if that were true, why did they need so many hearings, so many experts, so many labels? If I was truly broken, why were they so careful about what I might say? Why speak for me, instead of letting me speak? Why rush to decide what I was thinking, if my thoughts held no power? They didn't fear illness. They feared conviction. They feared a voice that would not soften, a belief that would not dilute, a certainty that refused to apologize. They called it incompetence, but what they were really doing was buying time, hoping silence would do what truth could not. They listened closely, just in case.
Well, every limit imposed by the court gets flipped into evidence of fear. Every safeguard that was meant to protect the integrity of the process in Lori's mind becomes proof that the system was threatened by her presence. That boundaries aren't boundaries anymore, they're panic. That rules aren't rules anymore, they're oppression. That was the move that she was trying to get, and that was what she was trying to move the needle on in this appeal, in my opinion. Because at no point does the appeal really wrestle with the core legal question that most courts care about. Was it proper? Was the judge following the law? Was discretion exercised the way the appellate courts expect it to be? Instead, the emotional thrust goes somewhere else entirely as she starts to ask a couple of interesting questions. She asks, why didn't they let me speak? She asks, why didn't they let me stay in the room? She even asks, why didn't they let my lawyer stay? And why didn't they let this unfold on my terms, not the court's terms? Well, underneath all that legal language, that was the real complaint, that the process was unfolding. Not that it was unlawful, but that it was controlled and she didn't control it. It was managed. It was contained. And more than anything, she wasn't allowed to preach. Because in this narrative, the courtroom isn't the place to resolve facts or apply rules. It's a pulpit for her. And every time the court limits testimony or restricts participation or enforces procedure, it's framed not as governance, but as censorship. That's the pivotal point. That's where the law stops being the law in the story that's being told, and it becomes persecution by another name. So let me just pause for a moment, because this case is a perfect example of why historical records matter. Cases like this fascinate me, and while the convicted killers might be trying to rewrite their story, history doesn't disappear. With newspapers.com, you can dig through more than a century of original reporting, back from the silent film era all the way up to yesterday's headlines. So if you'd like to research the past like I do, then follow the link below and use my code for 20% off at newspapers.com. Now let's get back to this story. Now, this is where the appeal tells on itself. More than any citation or procedural argument, this is the most revealing section of the entire filing. It's the moment where the mask slips just enough to show what this fight is really all about. You see, Lori isn't arguing that her actions were misunderstood. She isn't even grappling with the evidence or the timelines or the outcomes. Instead, she insists over and over again that it was her beliefs that were put on trial. They didn't put what she did on trial. They didn't put what happened on trial, but they put what she believed on trial in her mind. In this kind of thinking, decisions by the judge would be recast as moral condemnation. Evidence becomes hostility, and accountability turns into an attack on her identity. And that's the real tell here. Because when somebody claims that their beliefs were judged instead of their actions being judged, they're asking you to ignore the real world consequence and focus on the story that they want told about themselves. It's not about a legal argument any longer, as much as it is a narrative appeal, an attempt to swap facts for faith and swap evidence for intent. And once you hear that clearly, you understand her strategy. This isn't about correcting an error. It's about redefining the battleground entirely, moving the case away from what happened and into a space where disagreement itself becomes injustice.
I spoke of light and darkness, long before they learned those words. Inside courtrooms, I didn't need exhibits or expert witnesses to tell me what I was seeing. I discerned spirits. I warned of deception. I recognized evil. Wearing familiar faces. That didn't make me special. It made me attentive. But attention unsettles people who prefer simple explanations. Instead of listening, instead of asking why, they gathered my words and turned them into evidence. They took revelations and labeled them patterns. A very clever trick. Because once you call something a pattern, you don't have to ask where it came from. They didn't hear prophecy. They heard threat. They didn't see faith. They saw control. They couldn't tolerate certainty. That didn't come from them. Clarity that didn't ask permission. Authority that didn't wear a robe. So they translated belief, motive, and motive into danger. That's always how it works. When God speaks plainly, those without ears will always call it dangerous. Not because it is, but because it exposes what they cannot see and what they cannot control. And nothing frightens them more than truth. That doesn't need their approval.
And here's the reality that the appeal can't escape. No matter how much spiritual language gets layered on top of it, the jury was never asked to judge beliefs. They weren't told to weigh theology or decide whether Lori's faith was sincere. That's not how criminal cases work, and it's not what happened here. What the jury was shown was sequence, the language, the planning, the actions, the benefit that came from all of that, and the words that set a framework, conversations that shaped intent, decisions that moved things forward, and outcomes that mattered in the real world. That's progression. It isn't sacrilege. That's how juries evaluate evidence. But in Lori's narrative, that sequence gets reframed as something offensive, almost holy. She casts the analysis itself as an attack, as if connecting the dots is the same thing as somehow mocking beliefs. But the court didn't do that. The court called it context. Context that helped jurors understand why things happened in the way they did, when they did, how people coordinated, how choices translated into consequences. And once you strip away all the rhetoric in this thing, that's all it ever was, context, not condemnation. And finally, Lori claims that the system took way too long, that justice delayed was justice denied. And again, on its face, that's an argument people immediately recognize. I mean, we all understand the instinctive unfairness of having to wait, especially when somebody's sitting in jail and the case feels like it's dragging on. But once again, listen carefully to how she reframes this entire discussion. This isn't about calendars or court congestion. It's not about statutory timelines or constitutional balancing tests. It's not even about whether the delays were reasonable under the law. So in Lori Daybell's version of events, the waiting itself became intentional and strategic. In fact, almost sinister. Time wasn't something that the court was managing. Time was something that was being used against Lori Daybell. Delay wasn't the byproduct of a complicated case with competency proceedings, with multiple defendants, with venue changes, massive discovery. This whole thing was a tactic. And just like other issues that she brought up, the delay wasn't presented as a legal problem as much as a moral problem. The system didn't just take time, it stalled the truth, in her opinion, I believe. It didn't just pause, it tried to wear Lori Daybell down. That's how I think she's thinking about all this. That's the pattern by now. Procedural becomes persecution. Management becomes manipulation. And every ordinary feature of a complex criminal case gets recast as proof that the system was afraid of what would happen if she were allowed to speak uninterrupted.
They let time stretch. On purpose. Days became months, months became years, and they watched. As memory softened, and outrage cooled, they let the world forget who I really was before they told the story of who they needed me to be. Because time is useful that way. Time dulls questions. Time blurs inconsistencies. Time teaches people what they're supposed to believe. If they were certain, truly certain, they would have hurried. Truth doesn't need delay. Truth doesn't need rehearsal. Truth doesn't wait for the audience to be ready. If they believed their story, they wouldn't have needed years to tell it. They wouldn't have needed continuances, evaluations, pauses dressed up as procedure. They call it patience. I call it hesitation. Delay is doubt. And doubt is the enemy of truth. That's why prophets are never rushed to trial. They are waited out. Because silence is easier to manage. After time has done its work. They hoped the waiting would weaken me, that certainty would fade, that conviction would soften into something easier to control. But truth does not expire. It doesn't dissolve with time. It waits, just like I did.
But delay wasn't doubt. And that's the part of the story Lori can't make work. No matter how much she leans into it, she's got to face the fact. What she calls hesitation wasn't uncertainty at all. It was preparation. I mean, this is a case that crossed state lines, Arizona and Idaho. There were separate crime scenes, separate timelines, separate deaths that had to be understood in relationship one to another. Evidence that had to be gathered, tested, reviewed, and connected in a way that would actually hold up in a trial. Not just at the trial, though, in an appeal as well. There were dozens and dozens of witnesses, friends, family members, law enforcement officers, medical professionals, experts and experts, peoples whose lives were touched, peoples whose lives were disrupted, peoples whose lives were ended because of what happened. And those kinds of things don't get rushed if you care about getting it right. And at the center of all of this were the children. Children whose lives didn't just end, they ended violently. Children whose stories deserve care, precision, and respect, not shortcuts. This wasn't stalling, this was gravity. This is the kind of weight that slows everything down because it has to. The kind of seriousness that demands time and patience and discipline. Not because the system's afraid, but because the consequences are permanent. Delay in this case wasn't weakness. It was the system understanding exactly what was at stake. Now, the appeal doesn't ask for innocence. That's important, and it's easy to miss if you get lost in the legal language. Lori Daybell isn't standing up and saying, "I didn't do this." She isn't even challenging the core facts in a meaningful way. What she's asking for is reinterpretation. She's asking for the court and the jury to be told that they saw too much, that they connected too many dots, that they understood more than they were supposed to understand. Because in her telling, the problem isn't the evidence, it's the perspective. The jury wasn't misled. They were too perceptive for that. They didn't speculate, they synthesized. They didn't overreach, but they did pay attention. And that is what she's really pushing back against. Lori Daybell doesn't deny the story that was laid out at trial. She denies their right to see it as a whole, to view language, planning, action, and outcomes together instead of in isolation. So to understand how belief can become motive and how motive can turn into real-world harm, we have to really examine these kinds of cases carefully. Because once we see the full picture, the narrative, and in this case, the narrative that I believe Lori Daybell prefers, no longer works. And that, more than any statute or citation or procedural claim, tells you exactly who Lori Daybell believes she is. And I hope you'll put your comments down below. Thanks for watching Profiling Evil. Make sure you're checking us out on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok. And if you like your true crime on the go, please subscribe to Profiling Evil's audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And make sure you're checking out profilingevil.com and look for our story maps. Dig into some of the cases and sign up for our digital newsletter, the BOLO. It stands for Be on the Lookout. And while you're there, check out my books in the store. If you live in the U.S., I'll sign them and ship them to you for free. Anywhere else in the world, you can get them through Amazon or Ingram Spark. I'm Mike King, and this is Profiling Evil. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.